Let's bring in Washington Post reporter Ed O'Keefe, who's been covering this story. Good to see you, Ed.
Good to see you, Ed.
So there's been a lot of smoke surrounding the Trump campaign and its alleged connections to Russia, but still no fire. The Democrats see a fire, but a lot of others say there's no fire just yet. What's the real takeaway here?
I mean, there may not be fire in the sense that there's nothing terribly explosive or no direct connection between Russian officials, the Trump campaign, and the outcome. But the fact that this continues to trickle out is creating a small brush fire for the Trump administration, because it seems that they can't go more than 3 or 4 days without some other revelation about its ties to Russia, that somebody inside the administration now had been talking to Russian officials around the same time that questions were being raised about what exactly Russia was doing to directly affect the results. And I think, you know, we're now just over 40 days into this administration. They were having a very good week until Wednesday night. You know, 3 days in, but a 3-day stretch was notable for this administration. The president hadn't been saying anything on Twitter that was offensive or drawing away from the message of the day. He gave an incredibly well-received State of the Union or joint session of Congress speech, proved that he can do that. And then this happens again, followed up even last night with revelations that his son-in-law and the former national security advisor during the transition had also met with Russian officials.
So the Trump campaign and surrogates for the president have suggested that this is not coincidence, that they had a very good night after the president's speech to the joint session of Congress, and then all of a sudden the Washington Post, your newspaper, breaks this story. Is there any smoke there?
Well, you know, look, I can understand why a new administration who has an adversarial relationship with the press would start to draw conclusions. I wasn't involved in breaking this, but I know that we have sources across the government and around the world who have been reaching into us, to the New York Times, to other news organizations. I've said since the transition that this was likely to happen, that people, and it happened during the Obama administration too, people who are concerned about government policy reach out to reporters they trust and share information. But to say that we conveniently timed this for the day after, no. I think if it came out that way, it's because it took that long to sort out the information and properly report it.
Well, I was going to say, a lot of people think that these news reports get written the night of and then, you know, go straight to the presses, like in the movies. It takes days and perhaps sometimes even weeks to report that. Also, to be fair, as you point out, President Obama did have leaks as well. He aggressively pursued them, something that this president has suggested doing as well. So what questions remain unanswered, Ed?
I think there's going to be a focus on what exactly Attorney General Sessions was discussing with the Russian ambassador in Cleveland and in that private meeting they had in September. There are still questions about who else may have been in touch with Russian officials over the course of the campaign, and to what extent that really extends. Did now President Trump himself ever really talk to him? He says he didn't, and there's no evidence of that so far, but how close did it get to him? And then I think there are questions also about, did Trump himself, understand the extent to which people in his campaign were discussing these things? You know, he said yesterday that Sessions hadn't told him about his conversations with the Russians until he saw it in the press. That was the same thing that happened with Michael Flynn when the Washington Post reported about his connections. And so you wonder, is the president aware on purpose, or is he not being told these things, unaware on purposely, or is he not being told these things? Is the information being withheld, and what does he make of that?
Democrats are saying recusal's not enough. They want Attorney General Sessions to go.
Yeah.
What is the likelihood of that happening? It's a much harder case to make for perjury, which is what some of them are suggesting.
Here's a pro tip viewer's guide to anyone who's tracking the Trump administration for the next few months. He wears a red tie, they want him wearing a blue tie. He says one thing, they want to say another thing. There is nothing he's doing that Democrats are going to like. And to see 100 House Democrats as of 2 o'clock yesterday afternoon come out and say he should resign, that should be no surprise to anyone. They run the risk of sounding like a broken record, frankly.
The president even suggesting this morning on Twitter that they're overplaying their hand.
And there's some concern about that among Democrats I talked to and others who observe this, that say, you know, hey, you know, to ask for his resignation just a few hours later seems a bit opportunistic and desperate. And I think that's why you saw some nuance yesterday in what the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer was saying, is he joined his colleagues in saying, yeah, he should resign. But in the next breath, he said, absent of that, because basically saying, I know that's not going to happen, let's at least make sure that there's a fair and impartial investigatory process done here on Capitol Hill and by perhaps some other independent prosecutor. That would require an act of Congress. Acts of Congress these days are hard to come by, so one wonders how exactly this will drag out. But I think you're starting to see more and more Republicans acknowledge very quickly this has to be settled and dealt with and pushed aside so that they can focus on all the other things they have to do, because if they don't get it done by like Halloween of this year, it's going to be really difficult for this president to get anything done before next year's midterm elections.
Would the Republicans perhaps pursue bringing on a special prosecutor?
We haven't seen enough Republicans suggest that. I think there are some in the back of their mind who probably now acknowledge that that's something they should consider, just because have that going on concurrently and have somebody else deal with it. Remember, the intelligence committees are working on this. They've been working on it for several months. You saw Senator Roy Blunt yesterday, among others, say to launch a new independent investigatory effort would set this whole thing back several months and drag it out even longer. Democrats probably wouldn't mind that, but he has a point that perhaps you just allow what's going on right now to continue, make sure that it's done in a fair and impartial way, and let those details come out at a later date. But you're seeing more and more members of Congress say we need some kind of 9/11 Commission style group or an Iraq study group style entity of House and Senate lawmakers or a bunch of former members that we can bring in and have them do it on our behalf. We'll see.
We'll see. Final question. We're still awaiting a revised travel ban. That healthcare battle reform is still going on. Something about it being in a secret location. Rand Paul's not happy. So many questions still remain unanswered, specifically with the travel ban. I mean, there are reports that they were going to release it right after the president's speech, and they said, you know what, we're riding high right now. Let's hold off, suggesting to some that there are probably certain aspects of that a lot of people will not be happy with. What are you hearing?
Well, and it was supposed to be released last week, and for whatever reason it was delayed. Based on reports we've seen, you know, that they are revising it. I think they're trying to bring it within the confines of the concerns that have been raised by federal judges so far, and they're probably trying to avoid a further court fight. But the questions about which countries should be exempted and which ones shouldn't, if for some reason Iraq is not part of that group, and you leave all those other countries there, you would wonder why you're banning them at all. And it might even be seen as worse than before. Iraq, obviously, given the problems it's having, Syria, the problems it's having, Yemen. But if you remove Iraq, where all of this really started, and it's not part of the mix, I think it would raise just as many, if not more, and different concerns that perhaps the administration is actually purposely targeting certain countries for some reason.
So much more to talk about, but we have to leave it there. Ed O'Keefe, always good to have you.
Good to see you.
Thank you very much, Ed. Appreciate it.